There are wounds that bleed openly and wounds that fester in silence, and Eleanor Ashworth had learned to bear the latter with a dignity that cost her more than anyone would ever know. She stood at the window of her small bedchamber, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass, each droplet finding its way to join the others in their inevitable descent. And she thought how fitting it was that the sky should weep on a morning such as this, when the world outside seemed as grey and diminished as the world within. 3 years had passed since the midsummer ball. 3 years since Frederick Weston had spoken those words that still echoed in her memory with crystalline cruelty. And yet the wound remained as fresh as if it had been inflicted only yesterday, hidden beneath the careful composure she wore like armor. Her reflection gazed back at her from the rain-streaked glass, and she noted with detached observation the deep chestnut waves pinned at the nape of her neck, the single curl that had escaped near her left temple as it always did when she was distressed, the amber eyes that had once been compared to autumn leaves caught in sunlight, but now seemed dulled to the color of dried tea. She touched the small crescent-shaped scar at the corner of her right eyebrow, an unconscious gesture she made whenever her thoughts turned to painful things, and forced herself to stand straighter, to keep her chin level, to maintain the quiet dignity that was all she had left. The townhouse in which she stood was modest, situated in an unfashionable neighborhood where the genteel poor maintained their pretensions with increasingly threadbare determination, and Eleanor had watched their circumstances narrow year by year, room by room, until this small bedchamber felt less like a retreat and more like a cage. Her father's voice called from below, gentle and apologetic, as it always was these days, and she pressed her fingertips together in her lap, creating a small steeple with her hands as she gathered herself before descending. Thomas Ashworth sat in the parlour with papers spread before him, his kind face creased with worry, and when he looked up at his daughter his eyes held the particular anguish of a man who knows he has failed the person he loves most. "I have failed you, my dear girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and Eleanor felt her heart contract. "Your mother would be ashamed of me." She crossed to him and took his weathered hands in hers, offering comfort she did not feel, assuring him that they would manage as they always had, even as he explained that they had perhaps 6 months before they must sell the house, before they must find some smaller, meaner accommodation, before the last vestiges of their respectable life crumbled entirely. Later, alone again in her chamber, Eleanor allowed herself to remember what she usually kept locked away: Frederick's golden hair and calculating blue eyes, the rose silk gown she had saved months to afford, the moment when he had announced his engagement to Miss Harriet Crawford, while Eleanor stood not 10 feet away, and worst of all, his words, spoken loudly enough for all to hear. "My dear Miss Ashworth, surely you did not imagine I was serious. You were pleasant enough for a diversion, but hardly wife material for a man of ambition." She pressed her fingertips together until they ached, breathing slowly, deliberately, refusing to let the tears fall. She had survived this long. She would survive what came next. 3 days had passed since her father's devastating revelation. 3 days of careful economy and quiet desperation, and Eleanor sat in the faded parlour with a gown spread across her lap, her needle moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long ago learned that mending was preferable to replacing, when the sharp rap of the door-knocker shattered the afternoon stillness and sent her heart lurching against her ribs. She set down her work with deliberately controlled movements, refusing to let her hands tremble, refusing to allow hope or fear to show upon her face, for she had learned that expectations were dangerous things, sharp-edged and treacherous, capable of cutting deeper than any blade. Their elderly housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her expression caught between bewilderment and awe, bearing a letter upon a silver tray that had not seen use in years. and Eleanor noted immediately the weight and quality of the paper, the heavy cream stock that spoke of wealth beyond anything their modest household could claim, and most striking of all, the seal pressed into burgundy wax, an elaborate crest that she did not recognize, but which radiated importance with every elegant curve. Her father took the letter with hands that shook slightly, breaking the seal with a scholar's careful precision, and as he read, his face underwent a transformation that Eleanor watched with growing unease, shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like wonder. "The Duke of Ashford," he said, his voice strange and distant, "requests permission to call upon Miss Ashworth regarding a matter of mutual benefit." Eleanor heard the words as if from a great distance, her mind struggling to reconcile them with any reality she understood, for she had never met the Duke of Ashford, had never moved in circles where such an introduction might occur, and knew him only by the fearsome reputation that preceded him through every drawing-room in London. She recalled seeing him once, 3 years ago at a ball she had attended before Frederick's cruelty had driven her from society, a tall figure standing apart from the crowd, his bearing rigid and cold, his storm-grey eyes surveying the assembly with what had seemed like barely concealed contempt, speaking to no one, dancing with no one, a fortress of a man who appeared to find the entire proceedings beneath his notice. Why would such a man seek her out, a woman of modest means and tarnished reputation, a woman whose only claim to notoriety was having been publicly discarded by a fortune-hunting viscount? Her father was speaking of opportunity, of providence, his gentle face alight with hope she could not share, and Eleanor pressed her fingertips together in her lap, feeling the familiar pressure that helped her maintain composure when everything within her threatened to fracture. She would receive him, she decided, for she had no practical choice in the matter. But she would not allow herself to hope, would not permit her foolish heart to construct castles from this strange occurrence, only to watch them crumble as they had before. Whatever the Duke of Ashford wanted, she would approach it with clear eyes and a guarded heart, armoured in the hard-won wisdom of her humiliation. She would be practical, sensible, everything that had once failed to make her worthy of Frederick Weston's ambition, and she made herself a promise, silent and fierce, spoken only in the depths of her wounded soul. She would not love him, this cold duke with his mysterious purposes. She would not love anyone ever again, for she would be grateful if gratitude was required, would be dutiful if duty was demanded, would be whatever wife he required, if wife was what he sought. But she would not love him, could not love him, because she knew with terrible certainty that she could not survive being unwanted twice. The clock in the hallway had just struck 4 when the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones sent Eleanor's heart into her throat, and she rose from her chair with movements she forced to remain measured and unhurried, though every nerve in her body sang with tension as she smoothed the skirt of her best day dress, a modest gown of dove grey that she had pressed with particular care that morning, knowing it was the finest thing she owned, and knowing equally well that it would appear shabby beyond measure to a man of the Duke's wealth and standing. Her father stood as well, his gentle face pale with hope he could not quite conceal, and Eleanor wished she could feel what he felt, wished she could allow herself to believe that this strange summons might be the salvation they so desperately needed, but 3 years of nursing a wound that would not heal had taught her that hope was a luxury she could not afford. The housekeeper opened the parlour door, and then he was there, filling the modest room with his presence in a way that made the faded wallpaper and worn carpet seem suddenly more pronounced, more inadequate, and Eleanor found herself cataloguing him with the same detached precision she had used to assess their dwindling finances. Tall, taller than she had realized from that distant glimpse years ago, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical power held carefully in check, and grey eyes the colour of storm clouds over the sea that revealed nothing, absolutely nothing, of what he might be thinking, as they swept over her father, over the room, and finally, with an intensity that made her breath catch, over her. He moved with controlled precision, each gesture economical and deliberate, and when he spoke to her father, his voice was deep and resonant, clipped and formal, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Ashworth, I thank you for receiving me," he said, and Eleanor noted his hands as he accepted the chair her father indicated, large hands with long fingers that bore small scars across the knuckles, hands that had known work or conflict or both, so unlike Frederick's soft, manicured fingers that had never done anything more strenuous than lift a wine glass. She pressed her fingertips together in her lap, creating that small steeple that helped her maintain composure, and waited. The Duke did not waste time on pleasantries. "I shall speak plainly," he said, his grey gaze settling on Eleanor with an assessing quality that made her feel seen in a way she could not define, as though he were looking past the dove-grey dress and the careful composure to something beneath. "I require a wife. I have no interest in the simpering debutantes the marriage mart provides in such abundance. I have made inquiries, Miss Ashworth, and I am told you are intelligent, dignified, and sensible." He paused, and Eleanor watched a muscle flex near his temple, watched him clasp his hands behind his back as though restraining some impulse. "I offer you a practical arrangement. Marriage, security, my protection and my wealth, in exchange for a competent duchess and, in time, heirs. I promise you respect and comfort. I do not promise love." The words should have wounded her, this confirmation that she was being chosen for her usefulness rather than her worth. And yet Eleanor found herself appreciating his honesty, the blunt practicality that asked nothing of her heart. "I should like time to consider, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. He inclined his head, rising to leave, but at the door he paused and turned back, and when he spoke again his voice was lower, meant for her ears alone. "I give you my word, madam, that you shall never have cause to regret this arrangement. You will be protected, provided for, and treated with respect. I ask nothing of you but the same." Then he was gone, and Eleanor sat motionless in the suddenly empty room, aware of a scent lingering in the air where he had stood, sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, and she pressed her fingertips together until they ached, reminding herself of her promise, reminding herself that she would not love him, could not love him, even as something stirred in her chest that felt dangerously like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. The wedding had been a quiet affair, efficient and businesslike as Henry himself, held in the small chapel near the Ashworth townhouse, with only her father and a handful of witnesses present, and Eleanor had spoken her vows in a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will, while her heart raced beneath the modest ivory silk of her wedding gown, and Henry had repeated his own vows with his characteristic clipped formality, though she had noticed his jaw tighten when he spoke the words that would bind them together, and afterward, when they stood alone for a brief moment before the carriage arrived, he had leaned close and murmured, so quietly that only she could hear, the same promise he had made in her father's parlour. "I give you my word, madam, that you shall never have cause to regret this arrangement." And she had nodded, pressing her fingertips together in the folds of her skirt, reminding herself of her own silent vow, the one she would not speak aloud, the promise that she would not love him, could not love him, would not allow herself to be wounded again by wanting what would never be freely given. Now, as the carriage crested the final hill and Ashford Hall came into view, Eleanor felt that promise waver like a candle flame in a draught, for nothing in her modest experience had prepared her for the sheer magnitude of what lay before her, the sprawling stone edifice that seemed to rise from the earth itself, its countless windows catching the last light of the dying sun, its towers and wings stretching in every direction like the arms of some great sleeping giant. And she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had not truly comprehended what it meant to become the Duchess of Ashford, had not grasped the scale of the world she was entering, or how very small and insignificant she would appear within it. The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, and servants materialized as if from the very stones, footmen in immaculate livery, moving with practiced precision to open doors and lower steps and handle trunks. And Eleanor descended on legs that felt uncertain beneath her, her eyes travelling up the facade of her new home, while her chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to panic, and she touched the small crescent scar at the corner of her eyebrow without realizing she had done so, a gesture of nervousness she had thought she had conquered years ago. Henry appeared at her side, offering his arm with formal courtesy, and she took it, grateful for the steadiness of him, even as his proximity brought that scent she had noticed in her father's parlour, sandalwood and cedar, with its undertone of leather, a scent that was becoming disturbingly familiar, disturbingly welcome. Inside, the grandeur only intensified, marble floors and soaring ceilings and portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilt frames, and Eleanor felt herself shrinking with each step, becoming smaller and less significant, an impostor in borrowed silk who had no right to walk these halls. And she was so absorbed in her own mounting distress that she nearly collided with the woman who appeared before them, a figure of perhaps 58 years with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that seemed poised perpetually on the edge of either a smile or a cutting remark. "So you are the sensible creature my nephew has acquired," the woman said, her gaze travelling over Eleanor with undisguised assessment, and Eleanor forced herself to stand straighter to meet that penetrating stare with what dignity she could muster. "I expected someone rather more diminished, I confess. You have better posture than I anticipated." Henry's voice was clipped as he made the introduction. "My aunt, Lady Augusta Blackwell. She serves as hostess here and will assist you in learning your duties." Augusta waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, yes. I shall teach her which fork to use and how to terrify the housekeeper, all in good time. But first, let me look at her properly." She circled Eleanor slowly, and Eleanor held herself still, refusing to flinch under the scrutiny. There is steel in you, I think." "Good. You will need it." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened almost imperceptibly. "My nephew has been a fortress for 15 years, Your Grace. But fortresses, my dear, are meant to protect something precious within. I suspect you may be the first person to discover what he has been guarding." Dinner was an ordeal of crystal and silver, and courses Eleanor could barely taste, her awareness consumed by the weight of her new title, the expectations that pressed upon her from every direction, the constant effort required to maintain her composure when everything within her wanted to flee. And when at last the meal concluded and Augusta retired with a knowing glance, Eleanor found herself standing in the entrance hall with no idea where she was meant to go, what she was meant to do, how she was meant to exist in this vast and overwhelming place. She walked without conscious direction, her feet carrying her through corridors she did not know, past rooms whose purposes she could not guess, until she found herself pushing open a door and stepping into a space that made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. A glass conservatory filled with plants and the soft sound of rain against the windows above. A sanctuary of green and growing things that felt utterly removed from the cold grandeur of the house beyond. She stood among the ferns and flowering vines, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass, and for the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed her shoulders to drop, allowed the rigid control she had maintained to ease just slightly, allowed herself to simply breathe. She did not hear the door open behind her, did not know she was no longer alone, until a voice spoke from the shadows, deep and quiet. "You found the conservatory." Eleanor turned, startled, and found Henry standing just inside the doorway, his grey eyes unreadable in the dim light, his expression as controlled as ever. And yet, as she watched, something in his face shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, as though the sight of her standing among the plants had touched something he kept carefully hidden. "You need not perform for anyone in this house," he said, his voice low. "You may have whatever solitude you require. This room is yours, if you wish it." It was the first kind thing he had said to her, the first words that acknowledged her as something more than a practical solution to a practical problem. And Eleanor felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered. He nodded once, curtly, and turned to go. But at the door he paused, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the light from the corridor beyond. "Henry," he said, without looking back. "You may call me Henry, when we are alone." Then he was gone, and Eleanor stood in the peaceful darkness with the rain drumming softly on the glass above, and she pressed her fingertips together and reminded herself of her promise, reminded herself that she would not love him, could not love him, even as something stirred in her chest that felt like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. The first week of Eleanor's life as the Duchess of Ashford passed in a blur of new faces and unfamiliar corridors, and the constant, exhausting effort of appearing as though she belonged in rooms that seemed designed to remind her she did not. And yet, to her quiet surprise, she found herself rising to meet each challenge with a competence she had not known she possessed, managing household matters with the same practical efficiency she had once applied to stretching her father's meagre income, and the staff, who might have made her life a misery, had they sensed weakness, instead treated her with a respect that she gradually came to understand flowed directly from Henry's clear directive that his wife was to be obeyed in all things domestic, a protection he had extended without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. Simply one of the many small ways she was beginning to notice, he showed care without ever speaking of it. Augusta observed her progress with sharp-eyed approval, offering occasional guidance wrapped in acerbic commentary, and Eleanor found herself growing genuinely fond of the older woman, whose cutting wit concealed a warmth that reminded Eleanor achingly of her own mother. And it was Augusta who suggested, on a grey afternoon when rain threatened but had not yet fallen, that Eleanor might wish to explore the portrait gallery, where the history of the Blackwell family hung in gilt frames, along walls that stretched the length of the east wing. Eleanor walked slowly through the gallery, studying face after face, tracing the inheritance of grey eyes and strong jaws through generations, until she stopped before a portrait that made her breath catch. A beautiful woman with hair the colour of autumn leaves and eyes of deep grey, that held a warmth Eleanor had only glimpsed in fleeting moments on her husband's face, and she knew without being told that this was Henry's mother. Knew it from the shape of her mouth and the intelligence in her gaze and something indefinable that spoke of the son she had left behind. She was so absorbed in studying the portrait, searching for traces of the man she was coming to know in the woman who had borne him, that she did not notice the carpet edge that had worked loose from its moorings, and when her foot caught, she stumbled forward with a small cry of alarm, certain she would fall. But then hands caught her, one at her elbow and one at her waist, large and warm and impossibly strong, and she found herself steadied against a broad chest that smelled of sandalwood and cedar and leather, and she looked up into grey eyes that were very close, closer than they had ever been, and for a moment that stretched like honey dripping from a spoon. Neither of them moved, Neither of them breathed, and Eleanor felt warmth spreading from every point where his hands touched her, felt something kindle in her chest that she did not dare name. Then Henry released her abruptly, stepping back, his hands clasping behind his back in that gesture she was learning meant he was restraining some impulse, and his jaw tightened as a muscle flexed near his temple. "You should have that scene too," he said, his voice clipped and formal, nodding toward the loose carpet, and then he turned and strode away without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone before his mother's portrait, with her skin still tingling where he had touched her, and her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with her near fall. That night, lying in the vast bed in her chambers that still felt foreign, despite the fine linens and the fire crackling low in the grate, Eleanor pressed her fingertips together beneath the covers and reminded herself of her promise, reminded herself that she would not love him, could not love him, that this arrangement was practical and nothing more. But her body seemed not to have received that instruction. For every time she closed her eyes, she felt his hands at her waist, smelled his scent surrounding her, saw the intensity in those storm-grey eyes, and she turned her face into the pillow and wondered how long she could continue to lie to herself about what was already beginning to grow in the treacherous garden of her heart. The morning light fell soft and golden through the tall windows of Eleanor's sitting room, casting long rectangles of warmth across the carpet where she sat with a book she was not reading, her attention drawn instead to the view beyond the glass, where the grounds of Ashford Hall stretched in manicured splendour toward the distant tree line, and it was there, walking the gravel path with his estate manager at his side, that she observed her husband, his bearing as rigid and commanding as ever, his broad shoulders squared beneath his dark coat, every line of him speaking of authority and control, and she watched as he paused to speak with a group of tenants who had gathered near the stables, noting even from this distance how he inclined his head to listen, how his gestures were spare but deliberate, how the men before him stood straighter in his presence, yet did not cower, and she realized with a small start of surprise that he knew them, knew their names, for she could see him gesture toward one man and then another, could see the way the conversation flowed with the ease of familiarity, rather than the stiffness of mere obligation, and she pressed her fingertips together in her lap, and wondered how she had ever believed him to be simply cold, simply distant, when there was clearly so much more beneath that granite exterior. She was about to turn away, to force her attention back to the forgotten book, when movement at the edge of her vision made her pause, a small figure in a faded dress running across the grass with the heedless abandon of childhood. A tenant farmer's daughter by the look of her, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, her dark braids flying behind her as she raced toward the group of men, and Eleanor watched with idle curiosity that sharpened into alarm as the child's foot caught on an uneven patch of ground, and she tumbled forward, her small body hitting the earth with enough force that Eleanor could almost feel the impact in her own bones, and she expected, in that frozen moment, to see one of the tenants rush forward, or perhaps the estate manager, expected Henry to summon someone to attend to the crying child, who now sat in the dirt, with her knee scraped and bleeding, her wails carrying faintly through the glass. But what she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat, and her heart stutter in her chest. For the fearsome Duke of Ashford, the man society whispered about in tones of mingled respect and fear, the man who had built walls around himself so high and so thick that even his own aunt spoke of him as a fortress, that man knelt in the dirt beside the weeping child without a moment's hesitation, heedless of the mud that stained his immaculate breeches, heedless of the dust that settled on his polished boots, and he produced a handkerchief from his pocket with the same efficient grace he brought to everything, and he spoke to the little girl in words Eleanor could not hear, but could somehow feel, words that must have been gentle and kind, and perhaps even playful, for the child's sobs gradually quieted to hiccups, and then, impossibly, to a watery laugh. And when Henry lifted her into his arms and carried her back toward her mother with a tenderness that transformed his stern features into something almost soft, Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and pressed her hand to her mouth to contain the sound that wanted to escape, something between a gasp and a sob, for she understood now, understood with a clarity that pierced straight through to her heart what Augusta had meant about the fortress and what lay protected within its walls. She found Augusta in the morning room an hour later, the older woman engaged in her correspondence with the fierce concentration she brought to all her endeavours, and Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, uncertain how to articulate what she had witnessed, what it had meant to her. But Augusta looked up with those sharp eyes that missed nothing and said, before Eleanor could find words, "You have seen something that has unsettled you, I think." And Eleanor nodded and told her, her voice unsteady, about the child and the dirt, and the handkerchief, and the way Henry had carried the little girl as though she were something precious. And Augusta set down her pen and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "He has been hiding that boy for 15 years, she said, her voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "His father nearly beat it out of him. I wondered if anyone would ever see him again." Eleanor sank into the chair across from Augusta, her mind racing, her heart full of something she did not dare name, and she realized with a certainty that settled into her bones like warmth after a long winter that she wanted to see more, wanted to know the man behind the mask, wanted to understand every hidden corner of the heart he guarded so fiercely, and the realization should have frightened her, should have sent her retreating behind her own carefully constructed walls. But instead, it felt like the first pale light of dawn, breaking over a dark horizon, like hope, like possibility, like the beginning of something she had long ago stopped believing she deserved. The gardens of Ashford Hall had become Eleanor's sanctuary in the days since she had witnessed Henry with the tenant farmer's child, a place where she could breathe freely and think without the weight of grand rooms pressing down upon her. And she had taken to bringing her sketchbook to a stone bench near the ornamental fountain, where the sound of water and the scent of early blooming flowers created a peace she had not known she was capable of feeling any more. And it was there, on a morning when the sky stretched pale blue above the carefully manicured hedges, and the air held the first true warmth of approaching summer, that she found herself attempting to capture the graceful arc of water as it rose and fell, her pencil moving across the page with more hope than skill, for she had never been particularly gifted at drawing, but found the attempt soothing nonetheless. She did not notice at first the large white swan that had emerged from the reeds at the fountain's edge, its black eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed, in retrospect, to have been a clear warning. But she was absorbed in trying to render the way light caught the spray of water, and so when the swan began its slow, deliberate approach, she remained blissfully unaware until a sharp hiss made her look up to find the creature standing not 3 feet from her bench, its long neck curved in a posture that suggested it had taken personal offense at her presence in its domain. Eleanor rose slowly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, and attempted to retreat with dignity. But the swan was having none of it, circling her bench with the patient menace of a predator who knew its prey had nowhere to go. And when she sat back down in the hope that stillness might appease the beast, it merely moved closer, its hissing growing more pronounced, and she found herself in the absurd position of being held hostage by a waterfowl while the morning sun climbed higher and the fountain continued its peaceful splashing, as though nothing at all were amiss. It was into this ridiculous tableau that Henry walked, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he approached with what appeared to be estate papers in hand, and Eleanor opened her mouth to warn him, to explain, to say something that might preserve what remained of her dignity, but before she could speak, the swan struck, its orange beak darting forward with surprising speed to snatch the pencil directly from her fingers, and then, with an air of triumph that Eleanor would have sworn was deliberate, the wretched creature turned and glided back into the fountain's waters, her pencil held aloft like a trophy of war. The sound that came from Henry was so unexpected that Eleanor thought at first she had imagined it, a bark of genuine laughter that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, transforming his stern features into something younger and lighter and achingly human. And she stared at him for a moment of pure shock, before the absurdity of her situation overwhelmed her own composure, and she began to laugh too, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep within her chest. And they stood there together in the morning sunlight, laughing like children, while the swan preened in the fountain and her pencil floated slowly toward the center of the pool. Henry waded into the fountain without hesitation, heedless of his fine boots and the water that rose past his ankles, and retrieved her pencil with a solemnity so at odds with his sodden state that Eleanor laughed harder, pressing her hand to her mouth in a futile attempt at control. And when he returned to her side and presented the pencil with a small bow, water dripping from its point and his grey eyes bright with amusement, their fingers brushed, and the laughter faded into something warmer, something that made Eleanor's heart beat faster in her chest. He cleared his throat then. That familiar gesture she was learning meant he was about to say something that cost him effort, and suggested in a voice that held the ghost of humour that she might perhaps consider the rose garden for her future artistic endeavours, as the swans there were, in his words, marginally less larcenous. And Eleanor agreed with a smile that curved upward on the right side first. And when he offered his arm to escort her there, she took it, and they walked together through the gardens, while the swan watched from the fountain, and something between them shifted into an ease that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to name. The library at Ashford Hall had become Eleanor's refuge in the weeks since her arrival, a vast and magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and wisdom and quiet permanence, and she had taken to spending her afternoons there, curled into the deep window seat that overlooked the east gardens, where the light fell soft and golden through the tall windows, and the world beyond seemed to hold its breath in peaceful stillness. And it was there, on an afternoon when the sky hung low and grey with the promise of rain yet to come, that she sat with a volume of Byron's poetry open in her lap, her fingers tracing the familiar words of verses she had loved since girlhood, words that spoke of beauty and longing and the ache of unspoken feeling. And she was so absorbed in the rhythm of the language, in the way the poet captured in mere syllables what she herself could barely name, that she did not hear the door open, did not sense his presence until some shift in the air made her look up. And there he was, Henry, standing just inside the doorway, with an expression she could not read, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and she realized with a flush of heat that he had been watching her, that he had stood there in silence observing her in this unguarded moment, the afternoon light catching the chestnut waves of her hair and illuminating the curve of her cheek as she bent over the page, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a held breath, until he cleared his throat in that way she was learning meant he was about to say something that cost him effort, and asked, his voice carefully neutral, what she was reading. She showed him the page, her voice steadier than she felt as she told him it was Byron. She walks in beauty, and something flickered in his storm-grey eyes, something she could not name, but felt like recognition, like understanding, and he said nothing, offered no commentary or opinion, but his gaze lingered on her face as though he were memorizing something, before he inclined his head and withdrew, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the echo of his presence in the air. At dinner that evening, Augusta mentioned the county assembly approaching in a fortnight, and inquired with studied casualness whether they intended to attend, and Eleanor watched Henry's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly before he answered, clipped and certain, that they would. And Augusta's eyebrows rose in undisguised surprise, for Eleanor had gathered that her husband famously avoided such gatherings, preferring the solitude of his estate to the scrutiny of society, and yet here he was declaring his intention to attend, and Eleanor understood. with a warmth that spread through her chest, that he was doing this for her, that he meant to introduce her properly, to give her the standing and recognition that a duchess deserved. And after dinner, when Augusta had retired and they stood alone in the hallway, she thanked him quietly, her voice soft with genuine gratitude, and he shrugged, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back, in that gesture she now recognized as restraint, and said only, "A duchess should be seen." The words gruff and dismissive, even as his grey eyes softened almost imperceptibly when they met hers. Later, alone in her sitting room, Eleanor found a package wrapped in brown paper resting upon the small table by the window, and when she opened it with trembling fingers, she discovered a beautifully bound volume of Byron's complete works, the leather supple and rich beneath her hands, the pages edged in gold that caught the candlelight like captured fire, and there was no note, no inscription, nothing to indicate its origin. But she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like warmth, who had sent it, and she pressed her hand to the leather cover and felt something dangerous blooming in her chest, something that felt terrifyingly like hope, and she reminded herself of her promise, reminded herself that she would not love him, could not love him, could not survive being unwanted twice. But the reminder felt hollow now, felt like words spoken in a language she was slowly forgetting, and she held the book against her heart and wondered if promises made in fear could ever truly bind a heart that had already begun, despite all her careful walls, to reach toward the light. Sleep had eluded Eleanor for hours, her mind turning restlessly over the gift of Byron's poetry and what it might mean, what she dared not let herself believe it meant. And finally she had risen from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl against the chill of the corridor, her bare feet silent on the cold floors as she made her way toward the library, in search of something, anything, to quiet the tumult of her thoughts. But when she reached the great mahogany doors, she found them already ajar, firelight spilling through the gap in a warm amber glow that spoke of someone within. And she hesitated, her hand raised to push the door open, some instinct warning her that she was about to witness something she was not meant to see. She should have turned back, should have retreated to her chambers, and left him to whatever solitary communion he sought at this late hour. But something held her there, some pull she could not name, and through the narrow opening she saw Henry standing before the massive fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the flames, his broad shoulders uncharacteristically bowed, as though bearing a weight too heavy even for his considerable strength, and in his hands he held a piece of paper, old and yellowed, and worn soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded countless times, and his face. His face was stripped of every defense she had ever seen him wear, naked with a grief so profound that Eleanor felt her heart clench painfully in her chest. She must have made some sound, or perhaps the floorboard beneath her foot betrayed her presence with its treacherous creak, because his head came up sharply and his expression shuttered with the speed of long practice, but not quickly enough, not before she had seen the devastation in his storm-grey eyes, and she stood frozen in the doorway, an apology forming on her lips, certain he would dismiss her with cold formality, would rebuild his walls and send her away as though this moment of vulnerability had never occurred. But he did not dismiss her, and the silence stretched between them like a held breath, until finally he spoke, his voice rough as gravel, rough as she had never heard it. And he said without looking at her that the letter was from his mother, written in the final weeks of her illness, when he was 12 years old, written because she had known she would not live to see him grow to manhood, and had wanted to leave him something of herself, some piece of her love that he could hold when she was gone. Eleanor moved into the room without conscious decision, drawn by the raw pain in his voice, and she did not speak, did not offer the hollow comforts that people pressed upon the grieving like coins into a beggar's palm. She simply lowered herself into the chair nearest the fire and folded her hands in her lap and waited, offering only her presence, only the gift of witness without judgment. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, his scarred hands flexing around the fragile paper. And then he spoke again, the words seeming to cost him something precious, telling her how his father had changed after his mother's death, how the warm and loving man who had carried Henry on his shoulders and laughed at his childish jokes had vanished as completely as if he too had died, replaced by a cold and demanding stranger who saw sentiment as weakness and love as liability. "He told me grief was weakness," Henry said, his grey eyes fixed on the flames. "He told me love was a liability, and he spent 15 years trying to make me believe it." And Eleanor heard in his voice the echo of a boy who had lost not one parent but two, who had been taught to bury his heart so deep that he had almost forgotten where to find it. She did not reach for him, did not offer words that would only fall short of the comfort he needed. She simply sat in the firelight and let him know that he was not alone. And after a time he lowered himself into the chair across from her, the old letter still clutched in his hands, and they remained that way for nearly an hour, not speaking, the fire crackling between them, and the night pressing dark against the windows, until at last he rose and paused beside her chair and said, his voice still rough but softer now, "Thank you." And Eleanor understood that she had been given something rare and precious, a glimpse behind the fortress walls, and she carried that gift back to her chambers like a flame cupped carefully against the wind. The morning light fell soft and pale through the curtains of Eleanor's sitting room when she woke, and for a moment she lay still in the quiet, her mind drifting in that hazy space between sleep and waking, where the events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike, the firelit library and Henry's rough voice and the gift of his grief shared in silence. But when she rose and wrapped herself in her dressing gown and padded barefoot into her sitting room, she stopped so abruptly that her hand flew to her throat. For the room had been transformed in the hours while she slept into something from a dream she had never dared to speak aloud. Every surface covered with white camellias in crystal vases that caught the morning light and scattered it like diamonds across the walls. Dozens upon dozens of perfect blooms filling the air with a fragrance so delicate and achingly familiar that tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them, because she knew this scent, knew it from the pressed flower her mother had kept in her Bible, knew it from the single camellia her father had placed on her mother's grave each year on the anniversary of her death, knew it because she had mentioned it once, only once, in a letter to her father weeks ago, writing that she had seen camellias in the Ashford hothouse, and they had reminded her of her mother's wedding bouquet, and Henry had seen that letter, had remembered, had done this, and the knowledge of it broke something open in her chest that she had kept carefully locked away. She dressed with trembling fingers and went to find him, discovering him in the garden, where he stood with his estate manager, discussing some matter of drainage that seemed impossibly mundane given the magnitude of what he had done. And when he saw her approaching, he dismissed the man with a curt nod and turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral, his grey eyes watchful. And she stopped before him and found that her voice would not come, that the words she wanted to say had tangled themselves into a knot in her throat, and she managed only a whispered thank you that seemed wholly inadequate for the gift he had given her. He shrugged, his jaw tightening in that way she now recognized as discomfort with emotion, and said only that the hothouse had produced an excess, and it seemed practical to make use of them rather than let them go to waste. But even as he spoke the dismissive words, his grey eyes were soft as they rested on her face, and the corner of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly upward on the left side, and Eleanor realized with a flash of clarity that she could read him now, could see past the fortress walls to the man who hid behind them, and what she saw there made her heart clench with an emotion she could no longer pretend, was merely gratitude. Later that morning Augusta found her in the sitting room, still surrounded by camellias, and the older woman stopped in the doorway and took in the scene with sharp, knowing eyes before she smiled, a genuine smile that softened her usually acerbic features, and said that her nephew was courting her in his own inarticulate way, and the question was whether Eleanor intended to let him, and Eleanor heard herself admit, her voice barely above a whisper, that she was not certain she had a choice in the matter anymore, that her heart seemed to have decided without consulting her, and Augusta's smile deepened into something almost tender as she replied that perhaps there was hope for both of them after all. The evening of the county assembly arrived with a crispness in the air that spoke of autumn's approach, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chambers while her maid put the final touches to her hair, the deep chestnut waves pinned elegantly at the nape of her neck with pearl-tipped pins that caught the candlelight, and she studied her reflection with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that made her press her fingertips together in her lap, a gesture she caught herself making and forced herself to stop. For tonight she would be presented to the county as the Duchess of Ashford, and she could not afford to betray the trembling of her nerves. Not when Henry had gone to such lengths to arrange this. Not when he had agreed to attend an event he famously avoided simply to give her standing among their neighbours, and she was smoothing the silk of her gown, a deep rose that brought warmth to her complexion, when a knock sounded at her door, and Henry entered without waiting for a response, his tall frame filling the doorway, his storm-grey eyes finding her immediately and then travelling slowly, deliberately, from the crown of her head to the hem of her gown in a way that made heat rise to her cheeks. And in his hands he held a small velvet box that he extended toward her with the gruff declaration that it had been merely sitting unused, and she might as well wear it. And when Eleanor opened the box, her breath caught in her throat, for nestled against the dark velvet lay a delicate gold bracelet with a single luminous pearl, its beauty simple and exquisite. And she recognized it somehow, knew without being told that this was not merely jewelry, but something precious, something significant. And when she looked up at Henry, with questions in her amber eyes, he merely cleared his throat and said it had belonged to his mother, and that Eleanor should wear it if she wished, the words clipped and formal, but his grey eyes soft in a way that made her heart ache. And she held out her wrist silently and let him fasten the bracelet himself, his scarred fingers surprisingly deft against her skin, his touch lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary, before he stepped back and clasped his hands behind his back and said, his voice rougher than usual, that she would do. And Eleanor understood now that this was how he spoke when he meant something far more than his words conveyed. And when she descended the grand staircase to where he waited in the entrance hall, resplendent in his dark evening clothes, she saw his breath catch visibly, saw his grey eyes darken as they travelled over her again, and she felt for the first time in 3 years like a woman worth looking at, worth wanting, worth choosing. The assembly hall blazed with candlelight when they arrived, the music swelling through the open doors, the cream of county society gathered in their finest, and Eleanor felt the weight of curious gazes as Henry handed her down from the carriage and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. And as they entered the hall together, she was aware of the whispers that followed them, the speculation about the mysterious new Duchess. But Henry's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, and she drew strength from his steady warmth, from the familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar that enveloped her whenever he was near, and she lifted her chin and met the curious gazes with quiet dignity. And one by one the county families came to pay their respects, their deference to Henry extending to genuine warmth toward Eleanor, as they discovered she was neither proud nor cold, but gracious and intelligent, and she began to relax into the evening, began to feel something she had not felt in 3 long years, a sense of belonging, of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. And Henry remained close throughout, his hand finding the small of her back to guide her through the crowd, his touch proprietary in a way that sent warmth spreading through her, and she was laughing at something Augusta had said, her head tilted slightly to the left in genuine pleasure, when she felt Henry stiffen beside her, felt his hand press more firmly against her back, and she followed his gaze across the crowded room, and felt the blood drain from her face, felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. For there, standing not 20 feet away with a glass of champagne in his manicured hand, and a smile that did not reach his calculating blue eyes, stood Frederick Weston, Viscount Langley, and he was looking directly at her with an expression that made her skin crawl. And when he began to move toward her through the crowd, his golden hair dulled and his handsome face bloated with drink and disappointment. Eleanor's hand tightened convulsively on Henry's arm, and she felt the old wound tear open inside her chest, felt 3 years of carefully constructed composure begin to crumble, and she could not move, could not speak, could only stand frozen as her past walked toward her with poison in his smile. Frederick approached with the languid confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted, his smile curving with practiced charm that did not reach his calculating blue eyes. And when he stopped before them, Eleanor felt the years collapse, felt herself standing once again in that ballroom 3 years ago, wearing the rose silk gown she had saved for months to afford, felt the crushing weight of his dismissal pressing down upon her chest until she could scarcely breathe. And his voice when he spoke carried that same honeyed condescension that had haunted her dreams, saying, "Why, Miss Ashworth, I beg your pardon, your grace, how very far you have risen from our last meeting. I always knew you were ambitious," and the words were shaped like a compliment, but edged like a blade, designed to cut, to remind, to diminish, and Eleanor felt herself shrinking, felt the old wound tearing open beneath the silk of her gown and the weight of the pearl bracelet on her wrist, felt 3 years of carefully rebuilt dignity crumbling as she stood frozen and wordless before the man who had taught her that she was not enough, would never be enough, was pleasant enough for a diversion, but hardly wife material for a man of ambition, and she could not find her voice, could not find the words to defend herself, could only stand there with her hand tightening convulsively on Henry's arm, as Frederick's smile widened with the satisfaction of a predator who had found his prey wounded and vulnerable. But then Henry moved, stepping forward with the controlled precision of the fencer he had once been, placing his broad shoulders between Eleanor and Frederick like a wall, like a fortress, and when he spoke his voice was ice, was winter, was the cold promise of absolute destruction delivered in tones of perfect aristocratic disdain, saying, "Lord Langley, I believe you have mistaken my wife for someone who wishes to speak with you. You are incorrect." And Frederick laughed, a nervous sound that betrayed his uncertainty, even as he pressed forward with the recklessness of a man who had never learned when to retreat, making some comment about Eleanor being quite the practical choice for a man of the Duke's position. And Henry's response cut through the assembly hall like a blade, silencing the music, silencing the whispers, silencing everything but the devastating weight of his words as he said, "My wife is the finest woman in this room. That you fail to recognize her worth speaks only to your own deficiency. You will not address her again. You will not look at her again. If you do, I will ensure you regret it for the remainder of your miserable existence. Are we understood?" And the room had gone utterly still, every eye fixed upon the tableau of Frederick's face draining of colour, of Harriet Weston watching from across the room with bitter satisfaction curving her plain features, of Eleanor standing behind her husband's protective shoulders with tears burning in her amber eyes. And Frederick retreated without another word, his soft, manicured hands trembling as he melted back into the crowd that parted around him like water around a stone. And Henry turned to Eleanor with his grey eyes softening from slate to silver, the muscle in his jaw slowly unclenching as he asked simply whether she would like to leave or would like to dance, and Eleanor heard herself whisper that she would like to dance, and he led her onto the floor as the music resumed, his scarred hand warm and steady at her waist, and as they moved together in the candlelight, she realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming force of what she felt for this man who had stepped between her and her past, who had claimed her before all the world, who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, and she understood in that moment that her promise had been broken beyond all repair, that she loved him with a depth that terrified her, that nothing would ever be the same. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as they departed the assembly hall, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness, with her heart still racing from everything that had transpired, from the confrontation with Frederick and the devastating precision of Henry's defence, and the dance that had followed, during which she had moved through the steps as if in a dream while her body trembled with emotions she could not name, and now in the intimate confines of the carriage she was acutely aware of Henry's presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from his broad frame and the familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar that had become synonymous with safety, and she wanted to thank him, needed to express the depth of her gratitude for what he had done. But when she opened her mouth to speak, the words caught in her throat, and she managed only a quiet murmur that she did not know how to thank him for what he had said, for defending her so completely. And Henry shifted beside her in the darkness, his voice clipped and uncomfortable as he replied that Lord Langley had insulted his wife, and the response was appropriate, nothing more. But even as he spoke, his hand found hers where it rested on the seat between them, his scarred fingers closing around hers with surprising gentleness, and he held her hand for the remainder of the journey, while his thumb traced slow, deliberate circles against her palm, a touch so intimate and tender that it made her breath catch, and her pulse quicken, and neither of them spoke of it. Neither acknowledged what was passing between them in the darkness, but Eleanor felt each small circle like a brand upon her skin, felt the warmth of his touch spreading through her until she was trembling with something far more dangerous than gratitude. When the carriage drew to a halt before Ashford Hall, Augusta descended first with a knowing look that suggested she understood far more than either of them wished her to, and she announced that she was quite exhausted and would retire immediately, leaving Eleanor and Henry standing in the entrance hall with the tension between them thick enough to touch, and he looked at her in the candlelight with an expression she could not read, his grey eyes dark and searching, his jaw working as if he wished to speak but could not find the words, and finally he cleared his throat in that way she had come to recognize as a prelude to something difficult, and said only that she had acquitted herself admirably this evening, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that ached in her chest, that this was not what he had wanted to say, that there were words trapped behind his careful control that he could not or would not release. And she whispered her thanks with her heart in her throat, and he nodded curtly and retreated to his study with steps that seemed almost reluctant, leaving her alone in the entrance hall, with the echo of his touch still burning on her palm. In her chambers, Eleanor stood before the mirror and looked at the woman reflected there, the deep rose silk and the pearl-tipped pins, and the delicate gold bracelet still warm against her wrist, and she touched the single luminous pearl that had belonged to his mother, and remembered his thumb tracing circles on her palm, remembered the devastating certainty in his voice as he declared her the finest woman in the room, remembered the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious and irreplaceable, and she pressed her fingertips together in her lap, and admitted at last what she had been fighting since the first time he caught her in the portrait gallery, since the first time she heard him laugh, since the first time she saw him kneel in the dirt to comfort a crying child. She loved him. She loved Henry Blackwell with a depth that terrified her, and a completeness that left no room for the promise she had made to herself. She loved his hidden tenderness and his gruff care, and his scarred hands and his storm-grey eyes. And the realization was both liberation and terror, because she did not know if he could ever love her back, did not know if the man who had built such careful walls around his heart could ever let her inside, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could not continue as they had been, suspended between hope and fear, and something, somehow, would have to change. The days following the assembly passed in a haze of charged silences and lingering glances, of hands that found excuses to brush against each other, and conversations that seemed to say far more than their words contained. And Eleanor moved through Ashford Hall with a heightened awareness of Henry's presence that made her pulse quicken whenever she heard his footsteps in the corridor, or caught the familiar scent of sandalwood and cedar drifting through an open doorway. And she noticed with a flutter beneath her ribs that he seemed to find endless reasons to seek her out, appearing in the library when she was reading to ask her opinion on some estate matter that surely could have waited, lingering in the morning room while she took her tea, though he had always breakfasted alone before, bringing her volumes from his collection that he thought she might enjoy, and watching with that almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth when her eyes lit with pleasure at his choices. And in the evenings she had taken to reading aloud while he sat nearby pretending to review correspondence, his grey eyes lifting from the pages far more often than any letter could require, and Augusta watched them both with undisguised satisfaction, making pointed comments about the improving weather and the benefits of long walks in the garden that neither of them acknowledged, though Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks each time. It was on such an afternoon, while Eleanor sat in the drawing-room attempting to focus on her embroidery rather than on the memory of Henry's thumb tracing circles on her palm in the darkened carriage, that the butler announced an unexpected visitor, and Eleanor rose in confusion as Harriet Weston was shown into the room, Frederick's wife standing before her in a travelling dress of expensive but severe cut, her plain features composed into an expression that was difficult to read, and Eleanor's fingers pressed together in her lap as she invited the woman to sit, uncertain what could have prompted such a call from the wife of the man who had once destroyed her. Harriet sat with the rigid posture of a woman accustomed to holding herself apart from the world, and for a long moment neither spoke, until Harriet said with brutal directness that she supposed Eleanor was wondering why she had come, and before Eleanor could formulate a polite response, Harriet continued, her shrewd eyes fixed on Eleanor's face, saying, "You think I do not know what he is? I purchased him, Miss Ashworth, and I have received precisely what I paid for, a handsome ornament with a hollow core," and her voice was bitter as old wine, carrying the weight of years of disappointment and the grim satisfaction of a woman who had learned to find power in her own unhappiness. And she told Eleanor that Frederick spoke of her still, that he watched her at the assembly with something that looked remarkably like regret, that he understood now what he had discarded, and it ate at him daily. And Harriet's smile was cold as she added that she ensured his misery, that the fortune he had married her for remained firmly in her control and always would. And Eleanor sat in silence as this strange confession poured forth, feeling unexpected pity stir in her chest for this woman trapped in a cage of her own construction. And when Harriet finally rose to leave, she paused at the door and said with something almost like warmth that Eleanor had been fortunate that Frederick's greed had blinded him to her worth, fortunate that his cruelty had set her free to find something better. And after she had gone, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet drawing-room and thought of the two marriages, the one built on transaction and resentment, and the one that had begun as arrangement and transformed into something she had never dared to hope for, and she pressed her hand to the pearl bracelet still warm against her wrist, and felt gratitude flood through her, gratitude for Frederick's shallow cruelty that had led her here, to this house, to this life, to Henry. The storm had been building all afternoon, gathering strength beyond the windows of Ashford Hall like a living thing drawing breath. And Eleanor sat in the library with a volume of poetry open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in nearly an hour, her attention drawn instead to the man seated across the room, who was ostensibly reviewing estate correspondence, but whose grey eyes lifted from the papers far more often than any letter could require, and she felt each glance like a touch upon her skin. felt the weight of his attention even when she was not looking at him, and the air between them seemed to thicken with every passing moment until she could scarcely breathe for the tension of it. And when lightning split the darkening sky beyond the tall windows and illuminated the room in a flash of brilliant white, she looked up instinctively and found him watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter in her chest, his storm-grey eyes dark and intent, and filled with something she dared not name. And this time he did not look away, did not retreat behind his careful control, but held her gaze as the thunder rolled across the grounds and the rain began to lash against the glass. And Eleanor felt the moment stretch between them like a thread pulled taut, felt herself suspended in that electric silence where anything seemed possible and nothing was certain, and she thought she might speak, might finally give voice to the words that had been building inside her for weeks. But before she could draw breath, Augusta swept into the room with a pronouncement about the weather and the necessity of checking that all the windows were properly secured. And the moment shattered like glass, and Henry rose abruptly from his chair, with his jaw tight and that familiar muscle flexing near his temple, and he said good night in a voice rougher than she had ever heard from him. And then he was gone, retreating to his study with steps that seemed almost reluctant, leaving Eleanor alone with Augusta's knowing gaze, and the storm raging beyond the windows, and an ache in her chest that she could no longer pretend was anything other than what it was. She went to her chambers, but could not settle, could not quiet the tumult inside her that matched the fury of the storm outside, and she stood at her window, watching lightning tear across the sky and rain stream down the glass, and felt the truth of it crash over her like a wave she could no longer outrun. She had broken her promise utterly and completely. She loved Henry Blackwell with a depth that terrified her, and a completeness that left no room for the careful walls she had built around her heart. She loved his hidden tenderness and his gruff care and his scarred hands and his storm-grey eyes that saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one ever had. She loved the man he was beneath the fortress, and the boy Augusta said his father had nearly destroyed, and the husband who filled her sitting room with white camellias because she had once mentioned they reminded her of her mother. And she pressed her fingertips together and felt tears slip down her cheeks, and knew that she could not continue like this, suspended between hope and fear, watching him watch her, while neither of them spoke the words that hung between them, like the charged air before lightning strikes. Something must change. Something must break, and she did not know if she possessed the courage to be the one to break it. The storm had returned with renewed fury by the following evening, rain lashing against the windows of Ashford Hall with such ferocity that the glass seemed to shudder in its frames, and Eleanor found herself drawn once more to the glass conservatory, as if by some invisible thread, her feet carrying her through the darkened corridors to that sanctuary of green and growing things, where she had first sought refuge on the night she became a duchess. And she stood now among the potted palms and trailing ferns with her arms wrapped around herself, watching lightning split the sky beyond the glass dome above her head, and feeling the thunder roll through her bones like the echo of her own tumultuous heart. And she did not know what she was seeking here, except perhaps some echo of that first night, when everything had been uncertain and frightening and new, before she had known what it would mean to watch Henry Blackwell kneel in the dirt to comfort a crying child, before she had heard him laugh at a larcenous swan, before she had sat with him in firelit silence while he spoke of his mother's letter and his father's cruelty, before she had woken to find her sitting room filled with white camellias, because he had remembered a detail she had mentioned once in passing, before she had felt his thumb trace circles on her palm in the darkness of a carriage, and known with devastating certainty that she loved him, despite every promise she had made to herself. And she pressed her fingertips together, and tried to calm the racing of her pulse, when she heard the conservatory door open behind her, and turned to find Henry standing in the doorway, his dark hair damp from the rain, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that stole her breath, and he stepped inside and let the door fall closed behind him, and when he spoke his voice was rough as velvet over gravel, saying, "You came here that first night. I thought then that you looked like a bird seeking shelter from a storm. I did not know I would come to wish to be your shelter always." And Eleanor's heart seized in her chest as he moved closer, his hands flexing at his sides in that way she now recognized as restraint. And he cleared his throat once, twice, the muscle in his jaw tightening as he struggled with words that did not come easily to a man who had spent 15 years building walls against feeling. And finally he said, "I have tried to maintain the terms of our arrangement. I have failed. I told myself this marriage was practical, sensible, that I chose you because you were intelligent and dignified and would make a competent duchess. But Eleanor, that was a lie, I told myself, because the truth terrified me." And his storm-grey eyes were almost silver in the lightning's flash as he continued, "I saw you once before I ever sent that letter, across a crowded ballroom 3 years ago. You were standing alone near the windows, and the candlelight caught your hair, and I could not look away. I watched you all evening, and I learned your name, and I never forgot your face. And when I heard of your circumstances, I told myself I was being practical, but I was not. I was seizing an excuse to have what I had wanted since that first moment." And Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks as he spoke of the Byron, saying, "I never understood that poem until I met you. She walks in beauty. I thought it was merely pretty words. Then I watched you reading in the library that day with the afternoon light, turning your hair to burnished copper, and I understood what the poet meant. I have loved you. I think from that first glimpse across a ballroom. I have been a coward not to say it." And Eleanor crossed the space between them and took his scarred hands in hers and told him through her tears that she had promised herself she would not love him, that she had sworn she could not survive being unwanted twice, that she had failed utterly because she loved him with a depth that terrified her, loved his hidden tenderness and his gruff care and his storm-grey eyes and the way he remembered small things and acted upon them silently. And Henry made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and took her face in his gentle hands and said, "Then we are both cowards and both fools and both, I hope, done with pretending." And he kissed her as the storm reached its crescendo and then began to fade. And when they finally drew apart, the clouds beyond the glass dome had parted to reveal stars burning bright and clear in the velvet darkness, and Eleanor understood that Augusta's prediction had come true at last, that she had discovered what the fortress had been guarding, and it was a heart that had been waiting all along for someone brave enough to find it. Henry led her from the conservatory, with his hand wrapped firmly around hers, their fingers intertwined as though he feared she might vanish if he released her. And Eleanor followed him through the darkened corridors of Ashford Hall, with her heart pounding against her ribs, and her skin still tingling from the press of his lips against hers. And when they reached the door to his chambers, he paused and turned to face her, his storm-grey eyes searching her face in the flickering light of the wall. Sconces, and she understood that he was giving her the choice, that despite everything he had confessed, he would not presume, would not take what was not freely offered, and she answered him by stepping forward and pressing her palm flat against the door until it swung open, and the look that crossed his face in that moment was something she would carry with her for the rest of her days, a look of such naked wonder and gratitude and desire that it stole the breath from her lungs. And then they were inside, and the door was closed behind them, and the room enveloped her in warmth and firelight, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar that she had come to associate with safety and home and him. And Henry cupped her face in his scarred hands with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with fresh tears, and he whispered her name like a prayer, like a benediction, like something sacred and precious. And when he kissed her again, it was slow and thorough and devastating. And Eleanor discovered that the controlled exterior he presented to the world concealed depths of passion. She had only glimpsed that the man who spoke in clipped sentences and guarded his heart behind walls of stone could touch her with a reverence that made her feel like the most treasured thing in existence. And his hands trembled slightly as he unfastened the buttons at her back. And she realized with a surge of tenderness that he was nervous too, that this mattered to him in ways that went far beyond the physical. And she pressed her lips to the corner of his jaw and felt him shudder against her, and they learned each other in the firelight with whispered words and gentle touches, and moments of laughter that surprised them both. And afterward they lay tangled together beneath the heavy coverlet, with her head pillowed on his chest, and his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. And Henry spoke more freely than she had ever heard him, telling her of his mother's laugh and his father's transformation, and the years he had spent believing himself incapable of love. And Eleanor told him of Frederick, and the humiliation, and the promise she had made to herself that she had broken so utterly and so gladly. And when she finished speaking, Henry pulled her closer and pressed his lips to her hair, and said in that rough velvet voice she loved, "You will never feel unwanted again, I swear it." And outside the window the storm had passed entirely, and the stars burned bright and clear against the velvet darkness. And Eleanor understood at last what it meant to be truly chosen, truly wanted, truly loved. And she tilted her head against his chest and felt her lips curve upward on the right side first. And she knew that she had found her shelter, her home, her heart. The months that followed their confession in the conservatory passed like a dream from which Eleanor had no desire to wake, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married and the depth of feeling that flowed between them like a river finding its course. And she watched with quiet wonder as the fortress that had been Henry Blackwell crumbled stone by stone until what remained was simply the man beneath, tender and passionate and devoted in ways that made her heart ache with gratitude. And Augusta declared at least once a week that she had never seen her nephew so happy, and that she took full credit for the match, despite having done nothing whatsoever to arrange it. And Eleanor would catch Henry's eye across the breakfast table and see the corner of his mouth twitch upward on the left side. In that way she now knew meant he was suppressing a smile, and she would tilt her head slightly to the left and let her own lips curve upward on the right side first. And these small secret communications passed between them constantly, a language only they spoke. And when the London season arrived, and Henry announced they would attend the Marchioness of Pemberton's ball, Eleanor felt none of the dread that had once accompanied such events, standing before her mirror in a gown of deep midnight blue that matched the sapphires Henry had presented to her that morning with his characteristic gruffness, claiming they had been gathering dust in the vault and someone ought to wear them, though his grey eyes had been soft as storm clouds after rain as he fastened the clasp at her throat. And she wore his mother's pearl bracelet at her wrist, as she always did now, the delicate gold warm against her skin. And when she descended the stairs to where he waited in the entrance hall, Henry's breath caught visibly, and his hands flexed at his sides in that way that meant he was restraining himself from touching her. And he said, "You are," and then stopped and cleared his throat, and said simply, "Mine." And the single word held more meaning than any flowery declaration could have conveyed. And at the ball Eleanor moved through the glittering crowd on his arm, with her shoulders straight and her chin level, no longer the diminished creature who had once stood alone near windows, hoping not to be noticed. And society watched and whispered about the transformation of the cold Duke of Ashford, about the way his hand rested possessively at the small of his wife's back, about the way his storm-grey eyes followed her when she spoke with other guests. And Eleanor was received with genuine warmth by women who had once pitied her, and genuine respect by men who had once overlooked her. And then, across the crowded ballroom, she glimpsed a face she had once thought she loved. Frederick Weston, standing apart from his wife, with his golden handsomeness faded to something sallow and bitter, his blue eyes finding Eleanor and filling with naked regret as he took in her sapphires and her confidence and the devoted husband at her side, and Eleanor felt his gaze like the memory of an old wound that had healed cleanly, leaving only a faint scar to remind her of what she had survived, and she felt no satisfaction in his evident misery, only a profound and overwhelming gratitude that his cruelty had led her here, to this moment, to this man. And Henry had noticed Frederick's gaze, because Henry noticed everything where she was concerned, and he leaned close and said in that low, rough voice she loved, "He is a fool, and I am grateful for his foolishness every day." And then he led her onto the dance floor and pulled her closer than was strictly proper. And as they waltzed beneath the blazing chandeliers, Eleanor tilted her head to the left and smiled. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had found everything she had never dared to hope for. The years unfolded like the pages of a beloved book, each chapter richer than the last, and Eleanor stood in the nursery of Ashford Hall watching the afternoon light fall golden across the faces of her children. Her son William, with his father's storm-grey eyes and serious demeanour already evident at 4 years old, and her daughter Rose, barely 2, with Eleanor's own chestnut curls and a laugh that could coax a smile from even the most stoic of servants. And she marvelled at how completely her life had transformed from that rain-soaked morning when she had stood at the window of her father's modest townhouse, believing herself destined for quiet obscurity and carefully managed disappointment. And now Henry's arms came around her from behind, as he so often did, his chin resting atop her head as they watched their children together, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him, into the scent of sandalwood and cedar that still made her heart quicken after all these years. And William looked up from the wooden soldiers he was arranging with military precision, and said with great solemnity, "Papa, I am defending the castle." And Henry's chest rumbled with quiet laughter against Eleanor's back as he replied, "Then I shall leave the fortifications in your capable hands." And Eleanor thought of Augusta's prediction from so long ago about fortresses and what they protected. And she understood now that Henry had been guarding not just his wounded heart, but the capacity for this, for fatherhood and tenderness, and the kind of love that built rather than destroyed. And Augusta herself appeared in the doorway, with her characteristic acerbic observation that she had never seen a duke so thoroughly domesticated, and that she supposed she would have to take credit for that as well. And Henry replied with the dry humour. He now showed freely that she was welcome to take credit for anything she wished, so long as she continued to terrify the household staff into efficiency, and Rose toddled toward her great-aunt with arms outstretched, demanding to be lifted, and Augusta obliged, with a softness that belied her sharp tongue. And Eleanor's father had visited just last month, his gentle face bright with joy as he watched his grandchildren play in the gardens where Eleanor had once sketched while being menaced by swans, and he had taken her hands and said with tears in his eyes, "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become and the life you have built." And Eleanor had thought of the white camellias that still filled her sitting room each spring, Henry's silent annual reminder that he remembered, that he always remembered, and she thought of the pearl bracelet warm against her wrist, of the volume of Byron's poetry that still sat on her bedside table, of the glass conservatory where everything had changed. And she understood that happiness was not a single moment, but an accumulation of moments, of small gestures and quiet devotions, and the daily choice to love and be loved in return. And as the nursery filled with the sounds of children's laughter, and Augusta's pretended complaints, and Henry's low voice reading from a storybook he had somehow been convinced to narrate, Eleanor pressed her fingertips together, not to contain sorrow as she once had, but to hold fast to joy. And she tilted her head slightly to the left, and felt her lips curve upward on the right side first, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had been chosen not for convenience or practicality, but because she was irreplaceable, because she was loved with the same consuming passion she had once feared to feel. And the wound that had once festered in silence had healed into something beautiful, a reminder not of what she had lost, but of the path that had led her home. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our tale, though perhaps it is not truly an ending at all, but rather a beginning, for the story of Eleanor and Henry Blackwell continues still in the halls of Ashford, in the laughter of their children, and the quiet moments stolen between the demands of duty, in the white camellias that bloom each spring, and the volume of Byron's poetry that remains forever on Eleanor's bedside table, its spine cracked at the page where she walks in beauty like the night. And if you have journeyed with us through the storms and the silences, through the wounds that festered and the love that healed them, then you know already what Eleanor learned in the glass conservatory on that rain-lashed evening when Henry took her face in his scarred and gentle hands, that love is not always the lightning strike we expect, but sometimes the slow dawn breaking over familiar hills, that the heart knows its home long before the mind consents to follow, and that the grandest romance is often found not in the passionate declarations of poets, but in the quiet constancy of a man who remembers your favorite flower and fills your room with blooms because he cannot yet find the words to say what the gesture means. And Eleanor Ashworth, who became Eleanor Blackwell, who became the Duchess of Ashford, beloved by tenants and society alike. She who once stood at a rain-streaked window, believing herself destined for obscurity and heartbreak. She found in the end that the wound which had seemed her undoing was in truth the door through which her truest joy would enter. For had Frederick Weston not been the shallow fool he was, had he recognized her worth and made her his Viscountess, she would never have stood in that modest parlour, watching a storm-eyed duke clasp his hands behind his back to keep from reaching for her, would never have learned the language of his silences, or discovered the tender boy his father had tried to destroy, would never have pressed her fingertips together in joy rather than sorrow, or tilted her head to the left as her lips curved upward, watching her children play in the gardens, where a larcenous swan once stole her pencil and gave her back her husband's laughter. And so we leave them there, in the golden afternoon light of Ashford Hall, surrounded by love and legacy, and the profound peace of two souls, who found in each other the shelter they had always sought. And if their story has touched your heart, as it has touched mine in the telling, then carry with you this truth that Eleanor learned, and Henry proved, that we are none of us too wounded for love, too guarded for tenderness, too practical for passion, that the fortresses we build around our hearts are meant not to keep love out forever, but to ensure that when love finally enters, it finds something precious enough to have been worth protecting. And so, dear listener, thank you for walking beside Eleanor through her storms, for believing as she learned to believe that happiness was possible, for trusting that even the coldest duke might harbour the warmest heart. And may you find in your own life someone who remembers the small things and acts upon them silently, someone who steps between you and your demons, someone who looks at you across a crowded room and sees not what you lack but all that you are. And may you have the courage, as Eleanor did, to let yourself be loved.